We're so pleased to begin day two, today's opening of the virtual forum with the presentation of Fireside Chat titled, What Do We Want? Justice. When do we want it? Now. This session aims to help us better able to define what transformative justice is and its role in creating community and individual care and accountability, to disrupt and debunk the myths around the carceral system as the only or best solution to address violence and provide justice. And it also aims to provide some tangible examples of how to hold space for each other in our personal, professional, and community interactions. Before I have the honor of introducing our presenters for the fireside chat, I also just want to remind everyone that the virtual forum discusses alternative justice practices in the context of gender-based violence. We acknowledge that the discussion may include lived experiences related to gender-based violence, help seeking, and survivors' experiences. And some speakers may also share perspectives on working with those who have caused harm. We understand that these topics can be deeply personal and hold real everyday impacts, and we encourage you to engage in ways that are comfortable for you. So please feel free if you need to step away or take a break. And we'll also be posting a list of support services and a support person contact in the chat. I will now introduce our fireside chat session, which will be moderated and led by Nneka MacGregor in conversation with Dr. L. Jones. I'm very honored to welcome and introduce both Nneka MacGregor and Dr. L. Jones. Nneka MacGregor is the co-founder and executive director of the Women's Center for Social Justice, better known as Women at the Center, a unique nonprofit organization created by, for women, trans, and gender diverse survivors of gender-based violence, and is also a longtime member of the Learning Network Provincial Advisory Group. Nneka is an intersectional, abolitionist feminist, international speaker, and transformative accountability justice practitioner, an expert advisory panel member of the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability, and sits also on several boards and committees, including the Federal Advisory Council on the Federal Strategy Against GBV. You can see Nneka's complete bio in the forum program. Welcome, Nneka. It's an honor to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm going to now also introduce Dr. L. Jones, and then I'll pass it over. Dr. L. Jones is an author, poet, journalist, educator, advocate, and outspoken activist, thinker, and writer whose strengths converge in her spoken word performances. Currently, Dr. L. Jones is assistant professor in the Department of Political and Canadian Studies at Mount St. Vincent University. What defines her achievements is a commitment to activism and community advocacy to highlight inequities and redress injustices. The recognition of her performances, teaching, and political commitment testifies to the exceptional influence she has exercised during the Black Lives Matter movement and the expansion of Black scholarship in the Canadian academia. Her complete bio can also be accessed by checking out the forum program that's been linked in the chat. We're so honored to have you here today as well, Dr. L. Jones. I'm now going to turn it over to both of you to start the fireside chat session.
Beautiful. Thank you so very much. Hi, Elle.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. I am great. And I'm really, really excited about our conversation. But I want to start off by telling Elder Gloria, I love you. And the way you led yesterday and today, really, for me personally, I can only speak for myself. It centered and it grounded me. It really, really grounded me. And I know the conversations that sort of surround this work can be triggering, it can be activating, but having you in this space has made all the difference. So I'm profoundly grateful. Yeah. Yay. So, we're going to be talking about transformative justice and hopefully helping the participants in the community get a better understanding of what it is, why it is, how it is. But maybe we should start. Let me start by asking you, how did you come by this work?
So I think in some ways this work was quite literally bred into me. My mother's from Trinidad. So the Black struggle and the colonial struggle obviously formed so much of my identity. And that is a justice struggle, both in the context, obviously, of historical injustice. So we are the survivors of the slave trade, we are the survivors of colonization, and also the survivors of those injustices which are yet to be repaired. So not only do you understand that history, but you also understand, how little there is closure and how often the state or what other mechanisms do not serve us. So that was a big piece. I think also within that was the influence of so many mothers and women in my family. My family's like a matriarchy. I always say that we only have like one boy per generation. So the way that my family survived was through women supporting women. Women that went and worked as nannies and maids and left their own children. And so other people had to raise each other's children. So that communal sense of having to do what it took and find community solutions, I think that very much also trained me. And then, of course, with that perspective, I often say I became an abolitionist at the age of 13. I read Oscar Wilde's Ballad of Reading Gaol at that age, and it was the first really clarifying issue for me. It's a poem. Oscar Wilde, for those who don't know, was incarcerated for being gay under British laws against sodomy that still exist in many former colonized countries around the globe. I believe in over 70 countries, right? And so during his incarceration, he wrote a poem that talks about justice in prisons. And when I was 13, I read that poem and it really struck me. And I understood that prisons were an injustice at that point. And I say I became an abolitionist at that point. And that year we had to do an essay in social studies. And I decided to, everyone else did like photoshopping in magazines, and I did women in prison. And I remember going down to the local Elizabeth Fry and being like, I want to know more. And they were like, is your mommy in prison?
Oh,
What are you doing here? Like they just did not understand. And I wrote this little essay about, how women should be able to keep their kids in prison and be housed in community and stuff. So, and then the final thing I would say would be through poetry and through arts. So when I started doing spoken word, as an outspoken Black woman, I was talking about, so many social justice issues. I did not invent this, but this was like during the Obama age when I started. So we were so supposedly post-racial. So everybody was particularly offended, I think, by, me speaking about things like prisons and police and violence in schools. And so a lot of people like really hated me. But the people that embraced what I was saying and that really, reflected that storytelling would tell me more stories were the people who were being impacted by these issues. And they would invite me into spaces. And that's really where I learned from refugees, from sex workers, from people in prison, from people experiencing houselessness. All these groups are the ones that wanted me to come and speak at rallies when initially nobody else wanted to hear me. And through telling those stories, that just touches people. I think poetry in a particular way, and then people respond. And so going into prisons, going into community, doing community activism, being guided by elders like Dr. Lynn Jones here, the late Rocky Jones, so many elders in my community here in Nova Scotia, in Mi'kma'ki, where I am, the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Mi'kmaq people. So all of that really shaped my activism and my perspective and turned me to, understand that community is where we have to put our energies and that we have to find our solutions within these communal structures that we, particularly as Black women, have built over time. And now do I get to ask you the same question?
I think you should.
Okay. So can you
Uh,
tell us how you came to this work?
well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing that. I didn't know that um, at age 13. And I can tell you that I didn't come into the work so young at all. I came into this work in my 40s. I'm a survivor. I'm a survivor of attempted intimate femicide, which happened on Mother's Day 2003. And our children were witness to it. At the time, they were 15, 10, and 5. And we had the criminal legal system intervene, right? Because my 10-year-old son, our 10-year-old son called the police. And so he was arrested, he was charged. We were all subpoenaed to appear as witnesses, including my 5-year-old. And having gone through that criminal legal process, it was pretty evident early on that that was not the solution. That was not the way that would create any type of meaningful, lasting impact on him. It was very evident that the criminal legal response wouldn't change the trajectory of his life. And it was very evident that what I was looking for, um, you know, what I wanted from him wasn't going to happen through the criminal courts. And even though he was, convicted the first time, he appealed, and so the rigmarole started all over again. And still, it wasn't the outcome that I felt would have brought about the type of change in behavior, in attitude, and mindset that I think would have helped not just me, but the children and him and our families. And it was in conversations, this is in 2003, 2004, 2005, in conversations with my dad, who is my hero. My father, I remember him asking me, "So what do you want?" And I said, "Well, I want him to change his behavior so that he doesn't do this to the next person he gets into a relationship with." And I remember my dad at the dining table, he used to drink whiskey. He called it jigger. He poured himself a very tall glass of jigger and said to me, "Nneka, you have to think bigger. He's
Mm.
one person. And if he lives to be 100, the numbers of people, women that he's going to interact with, you can count them. But if you think about the broader system that engages millions of women and our children and our families, how the system it's best served, my energy is best spent doing systemic change so that I am in a position where I'm using my energy, my skills to influence the world and create a world where not just my three kids, I call them my three wishes, influence a world where my three wishes would not experience that type of violence, but my cousins, my sisters, your relatives, that nobody, no woman, no girl, no trans, no gender diverse person would experience that type of stuff. And that type of change does not happen pursuing the criminal courts. That type of overarching systemic work. And so it led me to start thinking very critically about all of these systems and how we engage with them, how the systems were designed in a particular way. And and I've talked about this often in the past as well, how I believe that the system is actually working the way it was designed to work. Because there are some people who are constantly fodder, right? They are the ones whose bodies are on the line. And in this instance, I'm talking about black bodies, black women, black girls, black trans, black gender diverse people as survivors are not believed by this system because of the embedded anti-black racism. And also black men who are overly incarcerated. And I want to talk about the carceral system later on, but it was this sort of critical journey of understanding how the world has been created and how the world is literally, it was this world that we're living in, right? The systems that we're operating under is literally man-made. It was made by men, rich white men, for the benefit of rich white men. And how tangentially, white women are tangentially beneficiaries, poor white men are tangentially beneficiaries, everybody else are fodder for it, and how that system, being man-made, can be remade. So my advocacy and activism was, well, what needs to be different? What can we do differently? And that sort of led me down the beautiful rabbit hole of this survivor-led, survivor-centered advocacy and activism that led me here.
Yeah, I think I'll try and talk louder. I see people. Is that better for people? I know that people were saying it was soft, so hopefully this is a better volume. But I think it's so important because I think so often when we start talking about dismantling prisons or moving away from the punishment system, the assumption is that you're naive about violence. That You must just not have encountered violence, because if you actually did, then you would know that the only solution is prisons and police, when in fact, transformative justice and these conversations have been led specifically by people who have encountered violence. We have had that trauma and we were failed by the system. We saw how it impacted our families. It did not help our communities. And we're actually turning to other solutions as a result. So thank you for being so vulnerable with us and so courageous in sharing, that journey that you had.
Yeah, well, I look at it, I don't think it's courage. I think it's necessity, really. I think about how, in my organization, we're all survivors of all forms of gender-based violence, and how we are so willing and able and open to use our lived experience as a way to create change. And if this is what it takes, then this is what it takes, right? If we have to step up and talk about it and talk about, again, trauma is not, it's not linear. There have been times when I've been angry to the point of, because out of frustration and out of irritation at how people are not listening, right? And how much money is spent on a solution that doesn't provide healing, doesn't provide justice, doesn't provide accountability. And so to me, it isn't courage that prompts me to speak. It's irritation, really. And we need to do something differently.
Yeah, I also think, when I started doing prison work, I was working with men as well as women. And, we always talk about, which is true, that women in prison are, of course, overwhelmingly victims of violence. And it always, as you said, irritation. It used to bother me so much that, we would talk about sexual violence or gender-based violence and victims until those women are victimized and end up in prison, which, we're 80 plus, 90 plus % of women, where 50% of women in federal prison are now Indigenous women. And we know there's no like crime wave of Indigenous women where you're walking around and oh no, Indigenous women just keep attacking me. So we know that the prison system is based on this colonialism and is tied to things like missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the removal of Indigenous women from land and community. So it always bothered me that, you could be a victim until that trauma turns into the sexual abuse through prison pipeline. And then now you're a bad person, right? And that myth of prison is a place where bad people go and the police catch bad people, as though the vast majority of people, and we all say it about women, but it was true of the people in men's prisons too. I don't think I've worked with a single man in federal prison that didn't eventually disclose some experience of childhood sexual trauma or violence as well. So yeah, as you're saying, like there just seems such an incomplete narrative that we could talk about gender-based violence or sexual violence or intimate partner violence, and then leave out the idea that this system we have to punish people ends up so overwhelmingly punishing the victims of those trauma, who then, become the bad people that we need to get rid of in society. And that just never added up for me. So what you say too about, yeah, just feeling that necessity to say like, this isn't, how can we be putting so many billions of dollars into this, not only in prisons and police, but at our borders, which we're seeing an increase in, we need to police the borders, in our child welfare system, removing children from their families, psychiatric systems, all these different systems of containment, and no money to actually build the things we need to actually heal ourselves. So.
Exactly. Which I think is a beautiful segue, because I'm into my next question around how would you define transformative justice? What does transformative justice mean to you?
Sorry, it's sending me a thing that my microphone isn't working. Is it actually working? Can you hear
I
me?
can hear you.
Okay. I just got this big thing on the screen, like alert. Okay. Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, what does transformative justice mean to you, Elle?
Yeah, I think I'll start with what it doesn't mean. I think a lot of people think that transformative justice therefore means a lack of accountability. That if we don't believe in, the police as our first call, if we don't believe that prisons are what successfully fights crime, then that must mean that we just want, murderers and rapists to run our streets, as people would say, and that we don't want to hold people accountable. It does not mean that. In fact, I think it means enhanced accountability. So that's the first thing is transformative justice is about accountability and not just a one-to-one accountability. So, when you're in the court system and it's, between the state and the person who's accused, but accountability between all of us. To think about all the ripples that justice has. Of course, the person at the center is the person most harmed. But as you just said, your children were affected. Your father is involved, your whole family, and then your community and your neighbors and people beyond that. And on and on and on. And we know that there's this huge chain of people that are impacted every time there's violence. And transformative justice tries to hold us all to account there and provide space for us to actually address that. So it's accountability. What it is not is just forgiveness, which is an extremely gendered narrative where women are told, in particular, femme people, and I'm not going to leave out trans women, non-binary people, etc. So, we're told to just move on and forget. There's only so long people will tolerate you being a victim, right? Like at first it's, oh, I'm so sorry for you. And then if you keep pursuing, it becomes get over it. Why are you being like this? I can see with your attitude why, so all this blaming that comes with being a victim, even though we hold up survivors in this way, like we say we hold up survivors, but then in reality, we all know that it's such a limited amount of time and then there's no sympathy. So it isn't about, just forgiving your attacker and moving on. It's actually about getting the healing and closure that you need. And I would say the last thing that I think is really important is collectivity. And that's through time as well. So recognizing generational trauma, recognizing the history that we come with, especially as Black women, we come with histories of enslavement, we come with histories of colonization, we come with histories of family separation, we come with family violence, white supremacy that has, completely destroyed our families, destroyed our minds, taught us self-hate, taken away our ability to love and relate to each other, taken away our economic base, all of these things that we experience. So to collectively think about our collective relationship and responsibility to generations before and in front of us, and then that collective responsibility and space we have for actually thinking about how violence is not individual.
Mm.
When somebody commits violence, yes, they are the perpetrator, but what led them there? And particularly when we're talking about intercommunity violence, right? How do we understand that without understanding the generational histories of trauma we have? So for me, transformative justice is not the soft option, right? It's not the, oh, you don't want to hold people accountable, oh, you're soft on crime, or whatever those narratives are. It's actually much more difficult because it asks us to do the difficult work of relating together, entering that space together, actually addressing harm, not outsourcing it somewhere else, but finding those solutions in a really difficult way and having those difficult conversations around conflict and harm. I'll say the last thing I would say is, like we can't even get rapists out of our friend circles right now, so we have to learn to have those conversations. And I often think they're impeded by people being like, oh, but I don't, if there's this punitive thing, then I don't want to, I can't deal with this because I don't want my son to go to prison, and trying to actually find that space to say, like, how do we actually hold each other accountable and have those conversations and deal in a deep way with conflict? So that's what it means to me. And I'm going to return the question to you. What does transformative justice mean to you?
I really loved everything you said, everything you said. I guess for me, at its core, it's about healing on the one hand and prevention on the other. And what sort of glues it all together is this desire. Transformative justice for me is a desire to create a world where violence of any kind doesn't happen. And if it does happen, that we have really loving, kind, and compassionate ways to surround and support not just the person who's experienced the harm, but also help the person who's caused the harm unlearn and do things differently, right? And not perpetuate it. To me, transformative justice is about sort of how do we finding ways to disrupt the status quo and then reconstruct a world that is based on love, right? I think I was thinking about this in the shower, what justice is. And I know everybody in the audience has their own definitions and their own ideas. But as I was thinking about it, there's a universal concept of just, fair, equitable, right way of being and doing things. But I think that it's a very selectively applied by people who happen to wield power in a particular time, space and time. So I have a definition, an idea of what justice is. My idea of justice should be universal, just like, the fellow across the border who just got elected. But because he has power, the way he wields his sense of justice is not to the benefit of people that look like me, or people who think like me. So justice it's supposed to be universal, but I think it's a very fluid concept that people can shift and morph to fit their own ends. I think about the legal framework of justice when you put it as offenses and punishment and retribution and vengeance, right? Which is what the criminal legal system's trajectory is. And I sort of juxtapose that with the transformative justice ideals of, rehabilitation, second chances, understanding that society, we have a sort of an ethical framework. Dr. Janice McCokis, in her beautiful keynote yesterday, was speaking about Cree ways of being in the world. And I think about transformative justice as asking me, Nneka, what's your purpose in the world? Right? How can I, how can we make each other more whole and share the world and all its resources with care and kindness and compassion? Because the current system it does the opposite. So transformative justice to me is a diametric opposite of the current legal system. And giving someone, what they deserve. Some people might say, okay, a rapist deserves to feel the violence that he inflicted on the survivor, on the victim. And I've met many survivors who hold that view, and I hold them as they hold that view because I believe that's their view, that's their right to hold it. I also know other survivors who think that, again, that retribution, I suffered, therefore you suffered, is not going to create the world where, like I said about my ex, it's a different outcome, right? It just puts people, in my opinion, it puts people in these cages, literal boxes, and dehumanizes. And it's a way to, I think, abdicate responsibility because we all have a shared responsibility for one another. And when harm is caused, we need everybody to come together. I think about how I healed, right? This incident happened. I was in a relationship for 19 years. It happened for 19 years, over 20 something years ago. And my healing journey has been on the hugs, the warmth and the love of family, community, right? My dad, my brothers, my sisters, my nieces. It was those people who held me and supported me so that regardless of what happened to the person that caused me harm, I was living my life out loud again. I was able to find joy, laughter, peace after all that violence. And I think about transformative justice as that community wraparound. And what would have really sort of been the icing on the cake is if he had had that same compassion, kindness, love, and wraparound to help him unlearn and accept responsibility. And my last point, because I'm really glad we're having this conversation. It's February, African Heritage, Black History Month. And I think about how justice gets denied to some at the expense of others. And when I think about these some, I'm talking about Black women, Black girls, Black gender diverse, and Black trans, not just the survivors. Black women are not going to report to police because the police is anti-Black. And I'm saying this openly. The criminal legal system has embedded anti-Black sentiments, has embedded anti-Indigenous sentiments in it. So for you to expect me to voluntarily call the police to come and help when I've been violated is counterintuitive. But then it means that if the police, the criminal legal system is not there to help me, who do I have apart from my community to turn to? So transformative justice is about turning inward for me into our community.
And the interesting thing is that, of course, when we say these things, that's ponies and fairy dust, right? But every year we spend more money on prisons. Every year we spend more money on the police. There's this myth that, after 2020, we defunded the police. We didn't. Every single police department has got more money than ever, which is more money in every city than our entire recreation budget, like combined for like transit, libraries, recreation. And I say that to say that, we've increased life sentences. They keep going up. We've decreased access to parole. We've increased the amount of time people stay in their cells. We've decreased programs. Everything has been towards more and more punishment, and it's not solving things. So that's not ponies and fairy dust to put billions of dollars into something that doesn't work. But if you or I say, why don't we try something else? Why don't we try giving families the supports they need? Why don't we build out the things in our community that we know work? Why don't we ask people, where do you turn? And then put resources there. Suddenly that's a fantasy. And we actually, like, this isn't fantasy because we already do this. And I really like that you said this. It already exists. So what we're talking about with transformative justice isn't, creating something out of nothing. It's saying that we have things that work. We know who in community that we go to that supports us. We know we have the capacity for mutual aid. We did that during COVID, right? When we brought groceries to each other. We found out ways to check each other. We kept each other safe at a time when that's all we had. So it's turning to things we already know how to do and then building those things out. And no, it's not going to be perfect, but the system we have isn't working either. And I would never, just to say on a final note, I would never tell somebody right now, like, if there's violence in your home, don't call the police because if there's no other, we don't have anything else built up. You have to do what you're going to do to keep yourself safe. But the question is, why isn't anything else built up? And what happens when you call the police and the person gets off or gets out in a couple of years and nothing's changed? And in fact, they're more violent because they were in a violent environment and now they're resentful. What happens then? We know that people they'll get these like lifetime sentences. In fact, some of the lowest sentences of like intimate violence and sexual assault, so what then? What else is in place? So I think it's really important to also say that it's using our own capacities, whether that's our capacity together to fight our landlords, our capacity to build and make gardens and cook together and build our own housing. These are part of transformative justice as well. Caring for the environment is part of transformative justice. Solidarity with Indigenous people and Indigenous sovereignty is part of transformative justice because it asks us to think differently about land and our relations. So it's taking place everywhere.
Yeah. I'm really glad you said that because I think about what does paradigm shifting look like? Actually, Margarita, can we share the slides?
Sure, no problem.
Because I
Sorry if
want
I'm meaning it. I'm trying to see the chat, so I don't need to be like moving back.
I can't even look at the chat, so I'm glad one of us is. Um, so I think about paradigm shifts and what does it look like? And it really requires us to move away from, language, right? The importance of language. These are words that are concepts and frameworks that I started thinking about like 2018, 2019. What is the solution? What's the opposite of misogyny? And what are the ways that we can actually create different frameworks, different ways of being and doing the world? And as my dad used to say, if it wasn't, if you're looking for something and you can't find it, then it was meant for you to go and create it. So I started thinking about what's the diametric opposite of misogyny. and couldn't find it. What's the diametric opposite of misogynoir, Dr. Moya Bailey's term? And there wasn't anything. So I came up with the word being misogyny, not just the verb of actively loving, right? Actively leading with love and kindness and compassion, where misogyny leads with hatred of. Misogyny is that framework that imagine creating policies that centers the people who are currently disproportionately decentered. Imagine creating programs that centers the people who are currently marginalized. And so, hold on, it's not. So there's homogeny, there's homogenous, which is about centering Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit communities. And again, what Janice was speaking to yesterday so powerfully, and addressing the genocide of Indigenous women, because the policies that currently exist is a deliberate attempt to erase, right? A deliberate attempt to silence. And by the same token, talking about Black History Month, the erasure of Black women, Black girls, Black trans, and Black gender diverse communities, coming up with a framework of a more genoir. And so for me, transformative justice is all of us, requires all of us to think of new ways of being in community with each other, new ways of leading, right, with kindness, with faith and trust in each other, because that's the only antidote, right, for the violence. That's the only way we're going to disrupt any of the violence that the systems that we have currently in place imposes, and not just on Black and Indigenous communities, because white people are not benefiting from the current system either, right? Poor people are not benefiting from the system either. This is a system that is dangerous and harmful and is killing all of us. And I constantly scratch my head as to why people are so invested in this system when it fails everybody. And so having this conversation with you, Elle, and trying to help people understand, number one, that it's not fantasy, it's actually happening. And it's happening by and with people who are leading from a place of love, leading from a place of hope. I'm going to end this slide. Can you turn it off now, Margarita?
Sure, no problem.
Thank
I
you.
was going to say, I recently got back from the West Bank and we went to a community.
Oh, we lost you.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. I was saying I recently got back from the West Bank just a few days ago, a couple of weeks ago, and we went to a community called Tent of Nations, and they gave us their principles of resistance. And it was one, we refuse to be victims. Two, we refuse to hate. So we will not allow ourselves to be made hateful. Three, we will maintain our faith, including our faith that we will find justice, and we put our energy forth into actions for justice. And that was that's transformative justice, right? That they were saying, okay, if you say it, tell me I can't build on my property, I'll live in the cave because this is the land that my grandfather put his hands into, and I will stay here. So I say that to say that like it takes effort though. So part of transformative justice, what I saw there, for example, was if people felt unsafe in their homes, people in the community would come and sleep 24/7 in the home. And I'm answering the question kind of somebody asked in the chat, like, what do Black women do? And this is what you do is your sisters come and keep you safe and hold you. If the children can't walk to school because they're unsafe, people come and escort you. And in doing that, you build your own power because you come to understand that you actually can resist and you can withstand and you do have dignity and you cannot be pushed down. So it builds and builds. So part of transformative justice is showing up for each other. Getting rid of the idea that we are powerless, getting rid of the idea that, we are only victims of history and not its subjects, that we can actually do things. So I think that's such an important piece that you start small and then you realize if I can show up to this community garden, I can show up in this other way. If I can show up to cook dinner with somebody and have a difficult conversation with them around violence, I can show up in this other way. It builds our confidence. So we don't have things in place, but we have the capacity. We do have. So yeah, I just think that that's really important. I encourage everybody in the chat. Like when you hear these like big ideas, you think, okay, but that's so far away. The prison wall is right here. But it's not far away. Every day, I say I'm a practical abolitionist. Every day we have the opportunity where we are to find ways to build justice.
Agreed. I love that. I love that. Elle, can you tell us more about why the carceral system doesn't work?
Yeah, so and I'm not gonna like plug my book, but I do have a book
Plug
called
your book.
Abolitionist,
Plug.
which I only say because it tells a lot of these stories. So most of my adult life, I did prison work. It started from poetry. And I don't like the term work. I have friendships and relationships with people who are behind bars. And so, it was going in that you really see I can't even describe the everyday violence of this system. I would go into Nova Institution, which is an institution for women for the Atlantic region. When we built that prison, so initially when we had Kingston Prison for Women, there were never more than 40 federally sentenced women a year in Canada. Once we built the regional prisons, we now have over 500 federally sentenced women. And as I said, 50% of whom are Indigenous, over 50% of whom are women with disabilities. So this is where people are being put that don't need prison, they need support. You would go into the max unit, it was entirely Indigenous women or trans men, basically. Those are the two groups. And you talk to a woman about why she was in max, and it would be, they would tell you a story like, my brother has been shot, my 3 sisters are dead, like just this horrible trauma. And so they were self-harming, and that's what was getting them put in the max unit. That they were cutting themselves, or they were hitting their head on the wall, and that was being put as a risk and something they needed to be punished for, not helped. And you would go right with these women. I would go right with these women. I got kicked out at one point because I hugged a woman and they were being raped. There was a literal male rapist guard in that prison preying on the woman. And not only women are in women's prisons, I want to acknowledge, are non-binary. There are trans men in women that are in prisons designated for women. And I would like, so you could rape the woman, but then, if I hugged a woman and said, take my number down, I'll see you when you're out, that was a violation. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that just basic human gestures that you make anywhere in the world were formed into a threat inside this prison. I would write with the woman and they would tell me stuff like they were a victim of human trafficking, and they were kept drugged in a motel, and one day they escaped naked and ran through the lobby, and the men who did it got 2 years, and then they were addicted to drugs. They were given $800, shipped home. They began stealing when they ran out of drugs, and they got 5 years. And you would just see this over and over again. A Black woman telling me that she was forbidden from attending socials because they said her dancing was too provocative. Women whose hair was falling out, Black women, because they wouldn't give them hair products. So their basic dignity and humanity and sense of themselves was taken. And then I was working with men, and these men were disclosing to me their childhood trauma. And I was the only person that was even having any empathy for them. So these men doing hard time that had committed violence, but then they would be talking to me about all the things that happened to them and all the ways they were failed. And I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that they'd gone their whole life and, nobody had ever intervened with them about molestation or violence, and they had turned it outwards. And the more I saw that, and yes, I worked with some people that had committed really violent acts. I'm not saying not everybody stole baby formula, the things that you want to imagine makes you innocent enough to care about. And I would be in difficult scenarios where sometimes it was someone who killed the brother of someone I was also working with, and I had to navigate that. I had to navigate working with people who had pimped and harmed Black women, and how I felt about that, and people that had harmed Indigenous women. And it wasn't easy, it's not like you just wake up and you sail into doing that and you never have doubts. I would have so many conversations with myself about, like, can I handle this one? I'm really troubled by what this person did. But, the more I did it, the more I actually saw that, well, if not me, who? If not this, when there's nothing else, if it's only that phone call, what else is there? And that person is going to get out, or they're going to stay in and commit violence. So, I just saw how colonial the system was. I've said, this is a system that is an extension of the residential school that continues to remove Indigenous people from lands and communities for the same reason, to take control of resources while denying Indigenous people the right to self-determination. it's a place where Black people are massively over incarcerated. So in my region, we're like less than 2% of the population and 10% of the prison population. Um, like, and on and on and on. And we're wrongfully convicted. There's miscarriages of justice. Every single woman in Canada who's been labeled a dangerous offender is Indigenous, except with like 2 exceptions, and not a single one committed an act of violence before they went to prison. So how was this helping our communities? So I saw so much violence, like overt violence, and then just the everyday violence. The everyday violence of living in that situation where you can't get a shower, where you're given shoes when you're checked in and they're not the same size, where you can't get access to laundry. Just the conditions, people that have diabetes that can't hit the button to get insulin, like on and on and on. And every day into my phone, this was pouring into my ear. And I wasn't surprised. Like I knew this is what the system was, but so I was shocked, but not surprised. Like the depths, people, pregnant women being, told to sleep without their mattresses because they were being punished and being taken in shackles to prenatal appointments. I could go on and on and on and on. And so again, it was having that contact both with people who I felt were victims, who, actually were wrongfully convicted, and with people who were perpetrators. But we were able to have conversations. And when we knew each other and talked to each other, I could talk to people about the harm they had caused. And they were remorseful and they did want to make reparation and they wished that they could be accountable and they wanted to do better for themselves and families. And there was nothing there. They were cutting the program. So, just as myself, I had so many failures, obviously, but then there were times when we were able to connect and people were able to change and do better. So, and they were changing each other. And that was the other thing, that the people in prison were advocating for each other and doing transformative work. And men were having conversations with each other. Like they would be like, oh, we heard you're a feminist. And then they argue with me about it. But then they'd be having conversations with each other. And we have that capacity. So, I saw so much resilience in prison. I saw so much advocacy. I saw terrible things, but I saw also our capacity to be changed. And so that really brought home for me, what we had to change, that we cannot find justice while investing in a violent system. And that includes globally as well. We cannot continue to do genocide. We cannot continue to support torture. We cannot continue to support war around this globe and think we can have justice at home. And then at home, how do we say, oh, well, you get what you deserve, do the crime, do the time, and accept that sexual violence is going to happen and physical violence and that you just deserve that? How is that justice? And how can I claim my own justice if it requires somebody else to be harmed in that way? I can't with that. So, yeah.
That's a mic drop moment because everything you said is the reasons when I started, we were funded in 2016 by the federal government to create this. The title of the funding was find an alternative justice model for sexual violence survivors. And so everything you've explained was what transpired, what we found from our research. And looking at the Black women who were the creators of transformative justice movement in the States, my girl crush, Dr. Beth Ritchie, as an example, looking at the way they talked about the systemic barriers and deliberate obstacles that were put in the way to keep large swathes of society, right, dehumanize them, treat them as if they were not citizens, equally deserving citizens of this world, was a way to have a semblance, to create this sort of dichotomy between them and us. And by creating this them and us, you forget that that is somebody's child, that is somebody's sister, that's somebody's mother, somebody's brother. And so for me, thinking about what we all can do, even if you're not a full believer like you and I in the transformative justice movement, we all can do better. We all can do more about how we treat one another. Like you were saying, you start incrementally, you start from home. You talked about COVID. I remember what happened during COVID, right? How people rallied. And this is a time when the world feels like it's burning. The world feels like it's burning, but it isn't because there's hope. There are people who are doing things that is actually transforming the way we view each other, the way we live our lives. I want to send a very quick shout out to my team. We every Wednesday we have a staff check-in every Wednesday with all the members of staff and our placement students. And we all go around, spend a few minutes. Each person has to talk about a mental noise, a gratitude, and a success. And today, the team were talking about how that space that we've created, we're virtual. Women at the Center is virtual. We have staff from all over the country. So we're not physically meeting, but we have this Zoom space where the team were talking about how safe they felt, how seen they felt, how heard they felt. And it was how we create community. And if we can do that, on a virtual space. We can do that in our personal lives when we leave this, and we can do that with our sort of broader community. So lead in with love and kindness and compassion and seeing your humanity in somebody else and recognizing that the current system, the status quo that we have now, is failing all of us. Is failing all of us. We have 3 minutes, Elle.
Yeah,
Can you share before we open it up for Q&A? What what are sort of the high takeaways? What do you want people to take away about transformative justice?
I think the first thing is, we know that we're not going to get full justice in our lifetimes. I don't believe the prison's going to fall in my lifetime. I don't believe policing is going to end in my lifetime. So I think we do what we can do to make things a little better around us. That's our task. And so I think sometimes when we talk, we feel so powerless. And I think that's part of neoliberalism, wants us to believe there's nothing we can do. They're in our phones, they have us tracked. Like, I'll lose my, like, it's a complete system and there's no way out, so just give up. And like you said, there is hope. Miriam Kaba says hope is a discipline. We have to practice it. And so I think, again, like, don't be intimidated by the idea that, okay, there's this big thing that we're talking about, because it's also small things. And I've seen so many practical examples. A woman that was in prison when I was going in, got out and got a job. She works with a foundation called North Pine. Her name's Sarah Tessier. And she got the folder that reintegrates prisoners, and is now, as a woman that was in prison, funding so many initiatives across this country to help prisoners reintegrate. That's transformative justice. And she remembered everyone who came in and helped her and said, here's strings-free money. Use it to do what you do. I mean, just the most beautiful moment. I've seen people come together and cook meals for each other. I've gone in groups when someone's like, I can't get this person out of my house, and we've gone and stopped that and literally come back to the house until the person feels safe. So no matter what it is, it can be cooking meals, it can be working in a garden, it can be starting a tenancy board. It doesn't matter. It's you have the capacity. So I think that's really important. And the second thing is just break the myth. I'll say the last thing because I know we're out of time. Break the myth that's taught to us from childhood, through our cop Lego and our Paw Patrol and our 50% of our TV being crime shows and our headlines, this propaganda that we're constantly fed, that, the only solution for crime is more money for prisons. And if you're not tough on crime, it means that then, you want sexual assault and murder and violence to run rampant. We have to break that propaganda. We know it's not true. We have all kinds of evidence that shows successful programs, successful civilian intervention in mental health, successful peer-based programs. So many people that are here today are doing that work. So we need to believe that we can do this work. And we need to, break the hold, and also not be like carceral feminists, right? Like, not accept the idea that, the solution for women is, we just need to put all the violent men in prison, because that's not how patriarchy works. Patriarchy is much broader than that. And the prison is a colonial patriarchal system, and we will never dismantle the master's house by using the master's tools. So now I'll ask you the same question. I know I always talk long.
No, you don't. You talk just the right amount. In fact, we should be talking more. What I want people to take away is that transformative justice is not the soft option. It isn't the easy route. In fact, to anybody who's ever gone through any of these community solutions that Elle and I are talking about, you know that it takes a lot. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of commitment. And it isn't the soft option that a lot of people in the gender-based violence sector think it is. I want people to understand that, like you said, you have the power, you have the capacity to actually create change in the lives of the people that are connected to you, whether they're other survivors or individuals who have used harm, right? Caused harm. You have power that you can use to actually shift again the trajectory of their lives. And don't be sold, just to repeat Hell's point, do not be sold on the hogwash, the nonsense that those who are behind the curtain, like the Wizard of Oz, right? The person behind the curtain is trying to fool us into thinking that we are different from one another. Whereas at the end of the day, we're all born of this earth. We're all born of women, from women, in the same way, 9 months gestation. We're all human beings that have desires, wants, wishes, dreams, hopes, and aspirations. And we have a responsibility to each other because I will do my part to help you accomplish yours. And I'm hoping that you will do yours to help me accomplish mine. And that's what transformative justice means to me.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Too short. Margarita, you want to hop back on? Do we have any questions in the chat that
We absolutely do have questions in the chat. First of all, thank you so much, Nneka and Dr. L. Jones. That was such a powerful and educational conversation. And you said mic drop. I think there were many mic drops during that conversation. I'm going to move us into the Q&A because we do have quite a few questions. We won't be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to do my best here. So we have someone who shared the recent launch of the Empower and Protect PSAs for Black women and Black femmes. They have experienced sufficient backlash from men in the Black community who are not appreciating or highlighting gender-based violence in the Black community. Patriarchy is very challenging as we continue to center Black women and Black femmes. How do you do this work while being uncompromising about safety for Black women and Black femmes?
Can I jump in very quickly? Because I want to talk about a project, and actually it's a movement. We're funding a couple of years ago by the Department for Women and Gender Equality Wage. It was a historic, quoting Debbie Douglas, it was a historic grant, the first time any government in any country in this world has provided funding to an organization to do the work of, and I quote, advancing gender equity for Black women, Black girls, Black trans, and Black gender diverse communities. And that work it's transformational in itself because it's the first time that we were able to do work in a Canadian context of gathering data, hearing the voices of BW, called acronyms BWGGDT, Black women, girls, gender diverse, and trans communities. First time we're gathering data on the experiences of Black survivors, as well as Black advocates and activists who are working across sectors, not just gender-based health, academia. So we're gathering research data because there is no data. We're also engaging we have a youth forum called the Black Youth Liberation Forum, which is bringing in the voices of young Black youth who, again, have no space to talk about their experiences of gendered anti-Blackness. We have an elders forum where we're bringing in the wisdom of elders in the Black community many of whom have been advocates and activists um, currently still are, but again, whose work has been erased or silenced. So we're shining a light on them. And then we have this amazing National Advisory Council that's made up of which L, right, as a member, made up of leading Black advocates, activists, scholars, people, frontline workers, to document our experiences. And I talked about the Emoji Noir framework. We're using that to actually build a policy framework that's actually going to shift. And to answer the question very explicitly, if we do not figure out a way that we can hold each other as BWGDT communities, it's going to be very difficult for us to expect others to hold us. So our work has been in coming together, creating what one of our National Advisory Council members called the sacred space, which is this beautiful meeting space where we can show up, talk about our lived experiences, talk about solutions, and actually create something that's going to be transformative, not just for our generation, but for generations to come.
And very briefly, I'll just add that, this is exactly why Black feminism as an ideology exists, because often Black women, are not served in white spaces. And then in Black spaces, there's a prioritization of men. So this is, of course, intersectionality, right? And so many people have talked about this. So I also turn to the work of our Black feminist foremothers. I find Audre Lorde, gives me comfort. When I read the work of Black feminists, it also gives me the strength to understand that I'm not, crazy. The things I'm feeling and thinking are not wrong. And if, I'm not a bitch, right? Like, because I want to do these things. So that alienation you sometimes feel and the critique you get because of patriarchy, I think it's also just helpful to reach back to our foremothers and bring that strength around you. You know that what we are doing is the right thing to do. And then it gives you the strength to keep pushing through.
Thank you so much to both. And Nneka, I believe you shared some of that information also as part of the related resources. People can look at some of that information that you're sharing as well.
Yes.
So I'm going to move us on to the next question is, how does transformative justice take into account colonization and settler colonialism, particularly on stolen land? Nneka, you touched on this, and the participant would like to hear a little bit more of specific ways as colonization and settler colonialism are essentially tied up to capitalist expansion, local and global, and its connection to transformative justice work.
Yeah, as I said, that's a beautiful question. As I said earlier on, the roots, the genesis of transformative justice comes out of the experiences of Black women, primarily Black women, disability activists in and people of color, activists of color in the United States. And it's from this understanding of how the commodification of Black bodies, how the experiences of Black bodies. Elle mentioned how um, the prison pipeline is tied to land grab, right? We've seen in Canada and in the United States and in the UK as well, actually all over the world, how the child welfare system is a way of moving Black children from the home and security of family into um, foster care and from foster care into prisons. And so understanding that there is this through line, this trend of the capitalist colonial system to extract labor, free labor, off of the bodies that look like mine. It was never hidden. They did it during the enslavement of Africans and the transatlantic slave trade, and they've just figured out new modern ways of continuing extraction our labor. And so for me, transformative justice is a way of shining a light. I usually drop the F-bomb, but I won't today, shining the light on all of that foolishness and helping all of us, not just the Black people who are experiencing that trauma and the violence, but also on everybody else, for you to see how the benefits that you are enjoying comes at the cost of somebody else's existence. And as human beings, what transformative justice is saying is that as human beings, we need to reach back into our empathy, right, our common humanity, and figure out ways that we disrupt capitalism, we disrupt colonialism, we disrupt the land grab. Elle talked about the genocide that was happening in Gaza, how brave it is an act of courage to actually stand and speak your truth when you know that the powers that be are looking and your funding is tied, right, to towing the political line. I don't care. Wrong is wrong. Genocide is genocide. We have to speak up against it. Colonialism, capitalism, land grab is impacting all of us. It's impacting Indigenous women, girls disproportionately. It's impacting Black women, girls disproportionately. And it's expected of everybody, white women, right? South Asian women, all women. We all need to stand in this fight. And also, talking about women, stand in the fight with trans women, especially Black trans women who are, again, disproportionately impacted by what's happening. And so to me, there is a call to open your eyes and understand that My humanity, right, and my life is dependent on yours as yours is dependent on mine. And we have to unite. Elle?
That'll be a long answer, so why don't we go to the next question and
Okay.
Sure.
read my book.
And your book has been added. People were sharing
Good.
it in the chat, the link as well.
Beautiful.
I think we'll have time for one more question here, and I think it's helpful. This person in particular is looking for some clarity and some answers. Can transformative justice work with restorative justice methods? So they're sharing that they sometimes think restorative justice could be a method for meeting transformative justice objectives, but they've also heard critiques that restorative justice cannot be reconciled within restored transformative justice. And so the question is, what do you both think?
Well, we understand restorative justice as a non-appropriated version is from Indigenous people, Indigenous communities, particularly Indigenous women, and it is the same principles. So restorative justice as enacted by Indigenous people is exactly the principles we're talking about. I think the critique of restorative justice is the way it's been appropriated by the state. And then, so I'm in Halifax. The one time Dalhousie University used restorative justice, you might remember, was to protect the dentist that threatened sexual violence against their classmates. And then they did restorative justice. That was to protect the institution. It wasn't actually to address violence. So those are the critiques, right? That when restorative justice is removed from the hands of Indigenous communities and Indigenous practitioners and then watered down, appropriated, and that like that's the problem. But in essence, Indigenous and Black women, we don't have the same histories, but we have a shared history.
Mm.
Um, we have different trajectories, and anti-indigenating, anti-Blackness is not the same thing, but we are victims of the co-disaster of colonization, genocide, and enslavement that happens, in Turtle Island. And so we know that the solidarity between us and our shared techniques only strengthens us. So, I, as a Black woman, cannot speak about these issues without also speaking about the work done by Indigenous communities. And that includes land defense, and that includes sovereignty, and that includes, land back, and that includes clean waters, and that includes all the work of Indigenous people in claiming self-determination, because again, there cannot be justice on stolen land. So that is true restorative justice. It's not just saying a land acknowledgement, it's actually thinking about what does it mean to live on these lands expropriated from Indigenous people, to live through an ongoing genocide against Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited people. And then how do we work alongside Indigenous communities and take direction from Indigenous communities as the stewards of this land to find justice? And that's what restorative justice means to me.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for the Q&A. Nneka, Dr. L. Jones, thank you. Thank you
I
so
really
much.
want to thank Nneka. She did more work than I did, as usual. So I really want to thank Nneka for taking leadership on this. I just want to say in front of everybody, like this wouldn't have taken place without your beautiful guidance and your beautiful shaping of all of this. So, so much love to you for bringing this together and all the work you did, along with the organizers. Thank you.
Well, the feeling is mutual. Thank you, Elle, for hopping on. And I echo your gratitude to Margarita. And I also want to say a special, special thank you to Dr. Janice McCokis, my sister from another mother, who she and I were consultants with Margarita for the Learning Network to set up this forum. And I'm just profoundly grateful to Janice, you, Margarita, you, Elle, and all the panelists who are speaking so beautifully on this issue. Thank you so much. And all
Thank
the
you.
participants.
And all the participants, I was going to say that was a powerful conversation. You'll see the chat. People are sharing their praise, their thanks. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here, for sharing with us today.